I've been winter camping for over a decade, and I'll tell you right now, nothing compares to the silence of a snow-covered forest at night. That pristine stillness used to be my escape from the world. Used to be. After what happened last December at Blackwood State Forest, I can't shake the feeling that something's always watching, waiting in that perfect quiet. My buddy Derek and I had been planning this trip for months. We are both experienced backcountry campers, the type who pack emergency supplies and always file trip plans. The forecast showed clear skies and temperatures around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold, but manageable with our gear. We drove 4 hours north, parked at the remote trailhead, and started our 6-mile hike to our usual camping spot near Crystal Lake. The sun was already low when we arrived, casting long shadows through the bare trees. We quickly set up our 4-season tent and got a small fire going before dark. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. There were no animal sounds. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. In 10 years of winter camping, I'd never experienced such absolute silence. Derek noticed too, but we brushed it off as just one of those weird winter things. After dinner, we were sitting by the fire when Derek pointed to something in the snow about 30 feet from camp. Fresh tracks, but not from any animal I'd ever seen. They were roughly circular, about 8 inches across, with what looked like 5 long toe marks splayed out from each print. They formed a straight line leading from the dense forest directly toward our camp, stopping abruptly at the edge of our firelight. "Those weren't there when we set up camp," Derek said quietly, his breath visible in the freezing air. "I'm sure of it." I grabbed our high-powered flashlight and walked over to investigate. The tracks were deep, at least 6 inches down in the packed snow. Whatever made them was heavy. But what really made my skin crawl was the spacing. The prints were easily 8 feet apart. Nothing I knew of could move like that. As I stood there, studying the tracks, the fire suddenly dimmed, as if something vast had passed between it and the stars above. That's when we heard it. A low, wet sound, like someone slowly dragging something heavy through the snow, and it was coming from directly behind us. Derek and I spun around so fast we nearly lost our balance on the snow-packed ground. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees behind our tent. Nothing. But the sound continued, that horrible, wet dragging, now seeming to circle our campsite just beyond where our light could reach. "We need to get out of here," Derek whispered, already backing toward our tent. "Pack essential gear only." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The dragging sound suddenly stopped, replaced by something worse. A series of sharp cracks from the canopy above, like something massive was moving through the treetops. Small clumps of snow fell around us as branches shifted overhead. We abandoned any pretense of being quiet. Derek dove into the tent while I kept watch. The flashlight beam darting between trees. The shadows seemed to move wrong, bending in ways that shadows shouldn't. My chest felt tight, each breath visible in the frigid air, coming faster and faster. That's when I saw it, or at least parts of it. Something pale and elongated, weaving between the trees about 40 feet up. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, like smoke threading through branches, except smoke doesn't have joints that bend backward. And smoke doesn't have fingers. God, those fingers. They were easily 3 feet long, wrapping around tree trunks as it moved. "Derek," I hissed, not daring to take my eyes off the thing. "Please tell me you're ready." The rustling in the tent stopped. No response. Still nothing. The thing in the trees had stopped moving too. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I turned the flashlight beam toward our tent. The back wall was shredded, torn apart from the inside out, and there, leading away from the jagged opening, was a single line of those same circular tracks we'd seen earlier, except now there were dark droplets in them, steaming slightly in the cold. A twig snapped directly above me. Something wet dripped onto my shoulder. And then I heard Derek's voice, except it wasn't coming from the ground. It came from somewhere up in the darkness above, and it said just one word: run. I ran. Every survival instinct I developed over years of backcountry experience screamed at me to stay calm, to think rationally, but rational thought died the moment I heard Derek's voice coming from above. My legs carried me through the snow-covered forest while my mind tried to reject what I'd just witnessed. The thing followed. God, how it followed. I could hear it moving through the canopy, that wet sliding sound punctuated by the sharp cracks of breaking branches. Sometimes it would get ahead of me, and I'd have to change direction when I saw those long, pale fingers reaching down through the trees. The moon cast enough light to throw its fractured shadow across the snow, a shadow that seemed to shift between shapes that shouldn't exist. I lost track of time. My lungs burned from the frigid air, and my legs trembled from plowing through knee-deep snow. Twice I fell, and twice I heard that thing drop closer to the ground, as if considering whether I was finally too exhausted to continue running. Each time, I forced myself back up and pushed on, trying to ignore the sound of Derek's voice, calling out to me, using words that weren't quite English anymore. Then I saw it, the faint glow of parking lot lights through the trees, the trailhead, my truck. Hope surged through my exhausted body, giving me one final burst of energy. I crashed through the underbrush, fumbling for my keys with numb fingers. That's when my flashlight caught something that stopped me dead in my tracks. More of those circular prints in the snow, fresh ones, leading to my truck. The driver's side door was open, and there in the front seat was Derek. The real Derek, what was left of him. The wet, dragging sound came from directly behind me. Something cold and impossibly long wrapped around my waist. The last thing I saw before it pulled me upward was Derek's blank face staring through the windshield, his mouth moving to form words I couldn't hear. I should have died that night. By every law of nature, I should have been torn apart like Derek. Instead, I woke up 3 days later in my truck at a rest stop 200 miles south of Blackwood State Forest. The doctors later said I was suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. They didn't mention the strange, circular bruises around my waist that took months to fade. The police found our campsite exactly as we'd left it. The shredded tent, the extinguished fire, those impossible tracks in the snow. But they never found Derek. The official report lists him as missing, presumed dead from exposure. They think he wandered off in the night and got lost. Sometimes I wish I could believe that too. I've spent countless hours researching since then, trying to make sense of what happened. I found old newspaper articles about Blackwood State Forest, about other winter campers who vanished over the years, about strange tracks in the snow that defied explanation. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or hallucinations brought on by cold and fear. But there was one article from 1932 that made my blood freeze. It described a logging crew that went missing, except for one survivor. Effie babbled about something that moved wrong in the trees, something that could wear people like masks. I don't go winter camping anymore, but every December when the first heavy snow falls, I get an envelope in the mail. No return address, no note inside, just Polaroid photos of different forests at night, taken from high up in the trees, and in each one, if you look carefully at the shadows between the branches, you can see something pale and elongated moving just out of focus. The worst part? In the background of every photo, there's a figure standing in the snow, looking up at the camera. It's Derek, or at least something wearing what used to be Derek, and it's smiling. I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me too. Sometimes at night, I hear that wet, dragging sound outside my bedroom window. And on really cold evenings, when the house is completely silent, I swear I can hear Derek's voice calling my name from somewhere up in the darkness, asking me to come out and play. I always loved winter camping, the silence of the snow-covered woods, the way the cold air sharpened my senses. It was a kind of solitude I craved. So when my friend Darren suggested a trip to an isolated part of the Rockies, I didn't hesitate. It was just the two of us, a tent, and miles of untouched wilderness. The drive up was uneventful, though the road was nearly invisible under layers of fresh snow. The ranger station at the trailhead was closed for the season, its windows covered in frost. That should have been our first warning. We parked the truck, loaded our gear, and set off into the trees, our boots crunching over the packed snow. By late afternoon, we'd found the perfect clearing to set up camp, a flat stretch near a half-frozen stream. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long blue shadows over the snow. As we pitched the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. No birds, no rustling branches, just silence. Then, as I was gathering firewood, I saw them. Footprints. Bare footprints. They trailed in uneven, meandering patterns between the trees, leading toward our campsite. The size looked normal, like a man's, but the depth was all wrong. The prints were deep, too deep, as if whoever left them was unnaturally heavy. "Hey, Darren," I called. "You see this?" He walked over, his breath forming a mist in the freezing air. His eyes narrowed as he studied the prints. "No way someone's out here barefoot," he muttered, "not in this cold." A gust of wind rattled through the trees, and for a second I swore I heard something else. Breathing. Deep, ragged breathing. But when I turned, there was nothing there, just the trees and the growing dark. We told ourselves it had to be an animal, maybe some weird pattern in the snow. But deep down, I think we both knew better. That night, as the fire crackled and the cold pressed in around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the tent fabric as we huddled inside our sleeping bags. The fire outside had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the canvas. Darren had already dozed off, his slow, steady breathing the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. But I couldn't sleep, not with the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest. Then, crunch. A single footstep, close. Too close. I held my breath, my ears straining against the silence. The fire popped outside, but underneath it I heard something else. A soft, wet inhale, like lungs struggling against the cold. I turned my head slightly, careful not to make a sound. Through the thin gap in the tent's zipper, I could see the fire's dying embers casting a faint glow across the snow. And that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of our camp, tall, motionless, barefoot. Its skin was a sickly shade of pale, almost blue in the firelight, and its ribs jutted out beneath what looked like tattered remnants of clothing. But the worst part was its eyes, wide and sunken, black pits that swallowed the light. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The thing stood there, barely breathing, as if listening, as if waiting. I shot up, shaking Darren awake with a violent grip. "Someone's out there," I hissed. He groggily rubbed his eyes. "What?" I didn't have time to explain. A shadow moved outside, blocking the fire's glow. The figure had taken a step closer. "We have to go," I whispered. Darren finally saw it. His whole body tensed as he clapped a hand over his mouth to keep from gasping. Then, from the darkness, a voice. "I'm so cold." Not a whisper, not a plea, just a flat, empty sound, like a recording played too slow. The zipper twitched, and then, all at once, the entire tent collapsed. The tent caved in around us, suffocating, the fabric pressing against my face. I thrashed, clawing for the zipper, but Darren was already ahead of me, yanking at it with frantic hands. The air outside was freezing, a slap of icy wind hitting my skin as we stumbled out, gasping. The fire had nearly gone out, only embers remained, glowing faintly in the dark. But it wasn't the cold that stole my breath. The figure was gone. No footprints, no sign that anything had been there, just the untouched snow surrounding our collapsed tent. Darren turned in a slow circle, his breath coming fast. Where the hell did it go? I didn't have an answer. I couldn't even process what I'd seen, but my gut screamed that we needed to leave. Now. We pack up, I said. We go back to the truck. Darren didn't argue. We tore through our gear, stuffing sleeping bags and supplies into our packs with shaking hands. But as I reached for my coat, something made me stop. The tent's fabric, the side that had been facing the fire, it was frozen solid. Thick frost covered it, spreading in jagged veins across the surface. I ran my fingers over it and a sharp, stinging cold shot through my skin. I jerked my hand back. My fingertips were numb, a deep, aching cold that didn't fade, like I'd dipped them in ice water. Darren, I whispered. Something's wrong, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at something in the snow. A single footprint. Not human. The toes were long, unnaturally stretched, the arch too high, the heel too deep. And worst of all, it wasn't just a single print. They surrounded us, a ring of footprints in the snow, perfectly spaced, encircling our entire camp. Darren cursed under his breath, his face pale. That wasn't there before. We didn't question it. We didn't wait. We grabbed what we could, leaving behind the tent, and started toward the trail as fast as our legs would carry us. But the woods had changed. The trail we had taken, the one we had followed in broad daylight, was gone. The snow stretched out, untouched, like no one had ever walked through it. And somewhere just beyond the trees, something exhaled, a slow, rattling breath, closer than before. We ran. I don't remember making the decision to move. I just remember the raw animal panic taking over. My boots pounded against the snow, Darren's footsteps just behind me. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sound that chased us. That breathing, deep, ragged, so close it felt like it was right at my neck. We're going the wrong way, Darren shouted. His voice was shaking, barely audible over the wind. He was right. The trail was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of trees. No tracks, no sign of the truck. Just white, empty silence. Then, Darren screamed. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in sharp, freezing gasps. He had fallen, his foot caught in a dip beneath the snow. His face was twisted in pain, but that wasn't what made my stomach drop. Something was standing behind him. It was closer now, no more than 10 feet away. Its body looked wrong, stretched too thin, its limbs too long, its skin the color of frozen meat. But its face, God, its face, was worse. It wasn't a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface, except for the holes where its eyes should have been. Black, endless, sucking in the light like two empty voids. It lifted a foot and took a step forward. The sound it made, the crunch of snow, the creak of something brittle beneath its weight, made my stomach turn. And then it spoke. Please. A whisper, a groan, a voice that didn't belong in this world. Darren was sobbing now, clawing at the snow to get up, but his boot was stuck. I lunged forward, grabbed his arm, and pulled with everything I had. The thing took another step, and another. It was reaching for him. Then, I saw it. My headlamp beam swept across the trees, catching something carved into the bark. A symbol, jagged, ancient. Without thinking, I grabbed the knife from my belt and slashed at my palm. The pain was instant, a bright sting against the freezing cold. Then I pressed my bloody hand against the symbol. The effect was immediate. A gust of wind slammed into us, knocking me back. The creature let out a horrible, inhuman sound, a gurgling, choking cry, and staggered away, its movements jerky, unnatural. Its form seemed to flicker like a dying signal on a screen. And then it was gone, just vanished. Darren scrambled to his feet, his face pale as death. What the hell was that? I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hand throbbed where I had cut it, the blood freezing against my skin. I just grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "We need to go." This time the trail was there. The truck was there. The world had shifted back to normal, like whatever had happened in those woods was never meant to be seen. We didn't speak on the drive back, didn't even look at each other. But just before we hit the main road, Darren whispered something under his breath. "I think it was never supposed to leave." I didn't reply, because deep down I knew he was right. But we had. And sometimes when I stand outside on cold winter nights, I swear I hear it. That slow, rattling breath, waiting. Winter storms in the mountains were nothing new to me. I'd spent years hiking, camping, and pushing myself into the wilderness, where most wouldn't dare. But even experience doesn't prepare you for the things that don't make sense. That's what happened at Dead Man's Pass. It was supposed to be a 3-day solo camping trip, just me, my gear, and the untouched white silence of the backcountry. The forecast called for light snowfall, nothing serious. But by the second day, the wind had picked up and a heavy storm was rolling in fast. I had no choice but to find shelter. My map showed a ranger's cabin about 2 miles away, one that was supposedly abandoned for the season. If I could reach it before the storm hit, I'd be fine. I quickened my pace, the snow already knee-deep, my breath coming in sharp gasps. And that's when I saw it. A light, faint but unmistakable, glowing from a window in the distance. The cabin. Relief flooded through me. If the rangers had left the place open for emergencies, I'd be able to wait out the worst of the storm, but as I trudged closer, something didn't sit right. The snow around the cabin was untouched. No footprints, no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there to light a fire. Still, I had no other option. I climbed the steps to the porch, shook off the snow, and tried the door. Unlocked. Inside, it was warmer than I expected. Not cozy, but not freezing either. A single lantern flickered on the table, its glow casting long, twitching shadows against the wooden walls. The place was empty. No bags, no food, no firewood stacked by the stove. Just the lantern, and one chair, pulled slightly away from the table, as if someone had been sitting there, watching the door. A gust of wind slammed against the cabin, shaking the walls. The storm had arrived. I had no choice but to stay, but even as I set up my sleeping bag in the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, somewhere, was watching. The wind outside had grown violent, shrieking through the trees like something alive. Snow battered the cabin, rattling the window panes. I told myself I was lucky to have found shelter, that I just needed to wait it out. But the unease sat deep in my chest. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting twisting shadows across the walls. I kept glancing at the chair by the table, the one slightly pulled back as if someone had just left it. It was stupid, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, someone had been here right before me. And maybe they hadn't left. I tried to distract myself, rummaging through my pack, checking my GPS. No signal. My watch read 12:03 a.m. Then, scrape. A noise behind me, soft, subtle, like wood dragging across the floor. I turned fast, my breath catching in my throat. The chair had moved, not by much, just an inch or two, but enough. Enough to know it wasn't my imagination. I swallowed hard, trying to force logic into the moment. The wind, I told myself. The cabin wasn't exactly stable. Maybe a strong gust had made the floor shift, but even as I thought it, my body refused to believe it. Because that's when I noticed the other chair. There were 2 chairs now, I was sure, absolutely sure, that when I came in, there had only been one, the one by the table. But now, sitting just a few feet away, half hidden in the shadows, was another. And in the dim light, I swore I saw the imprint of something sitting in it. The wind outside howled even louder, but I barely heard it. because at that moment the lantern flickered, and the chair creaked, like something shifting its weight, like something getting up. I didn't move. My body refused. My breath hitched in my throat, and all I could do was stare at that second chair, at the way it tilted just slightly, as if something unseen was shifting its weight. Then, tap, tap, tap the window. My stomach twisted. The snow outside was thick, blinding. No one could be out there. No one should be out there. But something had tapped on the glass. Slowly, heart hammering against my ribs, I turned my head toward the window. At first, I saw nothing. Just my reflection in the faint glow of the lantern, my face pale and stiff with fear. Then my reflection blinked, and I hadn't. I recoiled, nearly knocking over the lantern. Cold sweat slicked my skin as I forced myself to look again. Nothing. The window showed only the swirling snowstorm beyond. My own reflection stared back, wide-eyed and trembling. But when I turned back to the room, my breath caught in my throat. The second chair, was now right in front of me, and it was facing me. Something was here. Something was playing with me. I reached for my pack, for my knife, for anything that could ground me in reality. My fingers fumbled against the cold metal of my flashlight, and I flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the cabin. Nothing. Nothing. But then, the beam hit the farthest corner of the room, and there it was, a figure sitting in the darkness, not fully there, just the outline of it, like a smudge on reality. Its shape was human, but wrong, too still, too hollow. It sat in a third chair, a chair that had never been there before, and as my flashlight flickered, the thing slowly, impossibly, turned its head toward me. My flashlight flickered, once, twice, then died. The cabin was swallowed in darkness. I couldn't move. My breath felt trapped in my chest, my pulse hammering so loud I swore it echoed through the room. But worse than the darkness was the silence. Something had been there, sitting, watching. And now I didn't know if it was still in the chair or if it had moved. The wind screamed outside, rattling the cabin walls, but inside was suffocatingly still. I reached blindly for the lantern, fingers trembling. It flickered weakly, its flame barely holding on, and in its dim glow I saw them. 3 chairs, perfectly aligned side by side, facing me, all of them empty. I stumbled back, my boots scraping against the wooden floor, and that tiny noise was enough. The air changed. A weight settled around me, pressing against my skin like static before a lightning strike. And then, from directly behind me, a whisper, close, right at my ear. "Sit with us." I bolted. I didn't think, didn't breathe, just lunged for the door and wrenched it open. The cold hit me like a truck, but I didn't stop. I ran into the storm, snow blinding me, feet slipping as I charged toward where I thought the trail should be. Behind me, the cabin loomed, dark, empty. But just before I lost sight of it, I made the mistake of looking back. Through the window, I saw them. Not just one, not 2, 3 figures, sitting in the chairs, waiting. I didn't stop running until the sky turned gray with morning, until I saw the ranger station in the distance, until I knew I was out. I never found that cabin on a map again, but sometimes, in my sleep, I dream of a chair, sitting just a few feet away, pulled back, waiting for me to sit down.